My name is Davy Stinson. I was born in Fermanagh in 1954. I was very fortunate because as I grew up, my father was very interested in ornithology. Quite an unusual thing for a working class guy in Fermanagh at that time, I would think. He was also a hunter and a fisher. So I developed an interest in the outdoors as a young boy. My family were involved in small-scale farming in Fermanagh at that time too. So I was on the landscape, helping in hayfields when I was quite young. The landscape was quite different to what it is now. Then we had thick hedges everywhere. Mechanisation hadn't really come to Fermanagh. Lots of people, including my own family, didn't own a tractor. They were farmers, but they didn't have a tractor. And tractors only began to arrive on smaller farms probably in the late 60s, early 70s. So mechanisation has enabled people to change the landscape dramatically in that time. I suppose things like the Common Agricultural Policy over my lifetime have also changed the landscape. There's been a lot more drainage. Farmland has become more accessible because concrete lanes were put in the early 1980s, enabled people to bring heavier machinery onto their land. I suppose one of the most important changes was the change from haymaking to silage. As things intensified, silage took over from hay. Some people might say there was a climate issue there. The weather didn't suit hay so very well. The silage was cut earlier in the season. So as a result of that, we lost a lot of our ground nesting birds. Later on then, further intensification meant that cattle tended to be kept in during the winter time. That led to slurry, which was spread on the land. That impacted on water quality. It also impacted on invertebrate life on the land. And I think that may have had quite an important effect on our birds as well, especially birds like snipe, woodcock, who use their beaks to get down into the ground and eat invertebrates. At that time, not a common sight, but a very common sound in the countryside in Fermanagh when I grew up, was the sound of a bird called the corncrake. The corncrake was a fantastic species. They can barely fly, you would think, when you see them, but they migrate from Africa every year. Literally, there were thousands of them in Fermanagh when I was a young boy. But by the 1980s, they had started to decline. And I became slightly involved then with a project to look after the corncrake. And it was amazing when we started to monitor the number of birds. Every year, the population halved. And the first year I was involved, it was 160. The next year we had 80. The next year we had 40. And you can see that it just goes very, very quickly until the year we had none. And by 1995, I heard my last corncrake in Fermanagh. So those birds that nested on the ground disappeared. There were other birds, the partridge, which was a hunting species, grey partridge, the pheasant, which was probably an invasive species, it isn't native to Ireland, but wild pheasants were commonplace when I was a boy. They disappeared. I would say all ground nesting species, red grouse, all of them declined greatly. Now, the red grouse wasn't anything to do with silage that caused the decline in red grouse, but silage was a major driver of lowland bird decreases. My favourite sound, bird sound, would have been the corncrake. And I suppose that's because it was the soundtrack to my childhood. The number of times we walked home from somewhere and you could hear a corncrake in the field. It was absolutely brilliant. But it's gone, 30 years. Well, I suppose one of the things about Fermanagh is it's a very wet county. We're right almost on the west coast of Ireland. We're only a few miles from the Atlantic. And we get, for every litre of rain that blows off the Atlantic, we probably get 3/4 of a litre of it deposited on us. The rest of it goes to the other part of Ireland. But we're a very wet county, therefore we had a lot of very wet ground. That wet ground through things like the Common Agricultural Policy, that wet ground has been drained to a large extent. And we've then had improved grassland take over. On a considerable amount of that, of Fermanagh, I had no idea of percentage, but we still also have quite a lot of, for want of a better expression, unimproved land, where the natural vegetation is still evident, and especially in the more upland areas of Fermanagh. There are still a few people who have land in more low-lying areas who don't like the intensification, who have retained the hedgerows on their farms, who have not drained and maximised production to the nth degree. But a lot of people have, and that, in my opinion, that's been bad for our environment. But it's also very easy for me to say that because I didn't have to make my living as a farmer, which is the other side of it. And if you have an amount of land to make a living from, you try to raise a family, it's not easy to be a farmer. And it's not, it's very easy for conservationists to say, oh, you shouldn't do that. When I was growing up, my father would have brought me out. We've shot pheasants, woodcock, duck. And at that time, there were lots of all these species. I would say by the mid-1970s, we had all started to notice a decline. Certainly I moved out of Fermanagh for a few years, beginning in 1980. And by then, the declines were pretty noticeable. The wild pheasants were beginning to disappear. I probably didn't shoot any wild pheasants after the middle of the 1980s, maybe 1990. Red grouse were then so scarce that we stopped shooting them in early 80s. So declines were very evident at that time. Now, the reasons for those declines are myriad. Forestry was an issue for red grouse, fences were an issue, there were lots of things. But I suppose the Lough Erne Wildfowlers Council itself came about as a result of that, because we became concerned that our duck numbers on the loch were possibly falling as well, and we needed to do something about that. So we formed the Lough Erne Wildfowlers Association then, and later it became the Lough Erne Wildfowlers Council, an amalgam of a number of clubs. So that's where our conservation interest came from, because a lot of people would look at you as a shooter and think, well, why should they be interested in conservation? They kill things. But the bird I mentioned earlier, the corncrake, no one ever killed one of them, and they went. Shooting wasn't the driver for the decline. Certainly, if species get very scarce, it's a bad idea to shoot them. But we want a harvestable surplus of these things, and that's why we became interested in conservation, really. One of the memories that I have was one that came to me from my father. He actually heard the story from my great-grandmother. She died about 1960, and she was late in her 90s at that time, so she had been born in the previous century. Now, she got the story from her mother. They had lived at the end of a laneway in Fermanagh in the 1840s. Her mother had lived there. Now, Fermanagh was a very poor and very different place in the 1840s to what it is today. In the 1840s, the whole of Ireland suffered the potato famine. It affected Fermanagh as well, obviously. And there was a story came through my great-grandmother's mother that in the famine time, a family had arrived at the end of their laneway. They had been evicted from their house, which wasn't uncommon, unfortunately, in those times. It was very common in Ireland for people to be evicted because they couldn't pay their rent or other reasons. And they had been evicted, and they were then on the road. Food was very, very scarce, obviously. Nobody had any money. And my great-grandmother's mother's family shared a little bit of food with these people who put up some sort of a tent on the roadside and spent the night. But they had a baby. And it seems quite incredible. But the baby died during the night.